Emily Miller's bedroom sat on the third floor of the Miller family estate in Lake Forest, on the outskirts of Chicago, overlooking a wide lawn that lay buried in snow each winter and burst with lilac blossoms every spring. That night, when she was 19, the heavy oak door slammed shut behind her for the last time. She could still remember, word for word, the voice of her father, Robert Miller, at the time still executive vice president of Miller Meridian Corporation, not yet risen to chairman. His voice was never loud. He never needed to raise it to make people tremble. "You will terminate that pregnancy, or you will leave this house. The choice is yours, Emily." She had made her choice. 19 years old, without a cent to her name, one small suitcase, and a life growing inside her, she walked out through the wrought iron gates of the Miller estate on a cold October night, without looking back. Her mother, Sarah Miller, stood at the living room window without saying a word. She only watched her daughter's shape disappear into the darkness, both hands clutching a glass of red wine, her eyes bone dry. For Sarah, the family's honor had always mattered more than blood. Her sister, Ashley, only 15 at the time, stood tucked behind the staircase column, watching her sister leave with a strange, unreadable smile flickering across her lips. A smile whose true meaning Emily would only come to understand many years later. No one in the family knew that, in the leather folder the family's private attorney handed Emily that night, along with a stack of cash, to help her disappear quietly, there was also a $10 million life insurance policy taken out in her name, with a clause stating that if Emily Miller never returned to the United States, that sum, along with her identity, would fall entirely under the control of a secondary beneficiary. Emily had signed the papers through tears, not reading them closely, not fully understanding what she was giving up. She only knew she needed to leave, needed to protect the child in her womb from a family willing to force her to abort it. That night, she boarded a one-way flight to Boston, where a distant cousin had agreed to let her stay for a few months. 9 months later, Lily was born in a small public hospital, no grandparents, no aunts or uncles, only Emily and the first cry of her newborn daughter. 11 years is long enough for a naive 20-year-old to become a sharp 34-year-old woman. Long enough for old wounds to scar over without ever truly healing. And long enough for a carefully buried secret to begin cracking at its smallest seams. Emily had worked day and night to raise her daughter while finishing college, then law school, on scholarships and mounting student loans. She hadn't chosen the field of financial fraud by accident. She wanted to understand, fully, the language her family had used to determine her fate, money, contracts, and hidden clauses. 4 years ago, at a small law firm in New York, Emily received an anonymous client file connected to a suspected money laundering case involving a charitable foundation in Chicago. She hadn't thought much of it, until she saw the name, Miller Renewal Foundation. From that moment, she quietly began investigating. Not out of hatred, though hatred certainly played some part, but because she needed to know the truth. She needed to know why, and how, her name had become attached to financial transactions she had never signed, never even known about. 3 years later, Emily had become one of the most respected financial fraud investigation attorneys in New York, and she received the call she had been waiting for. The FBI, in coordination with the Department of Justice, invited her to serve as special legal counsel for a federal investigation targeting Miller Meridian Corporation and its affiliated charitable foundation. She accepted on the spot. The cream-colored invitation card, gold-trimmed and printed in classic calligraphy, sat on Emily's desk one June morning. "You are cordially invited to attend the 65th birthday gala of Mr. Robert Miller, chairman of Miller Meridian Corporation, to be held at the Peninsula, Chicago." She held the card in her hand for a long while. This wasn't the first invitation the family had sent. Every year, on major holidays, a similar card would appear in her mailbox, an empty ritual to maintain the appearance that the family still keeps in touch in front of Chicago's elite. Emily had never responded, never once appeared. But this year was different. This year, on her desk sat another file, thick, black leather-bound, stamped confidential, federal investigation. Inside lay the results of nearly 3 years of investigation, $14 million in illicit transfers from the Miller Renewal Fund to anonymous accounts in the Cayman Islands, every single one bearing the signature of Emily Miller. She had spent hundreds of hours proving those signatures were forged. She had hired 3 independent handwriting experts, cross-referencing them against dozens of authentic samples of her own signature spanning 11 years. The results were unanimous. This was a sophisticated forgery, practiced over a long period by someone with access to a great many original samples of her handwriting. Samples from childhood, from old yearbooks, from handwritten birthday cards that only someone inside the family could possibly possess. Governor James Sullivan, her father's old friend, and also the senior overseer of this federal investigation in his former capacity as a federal prosecutor before entering politics, had called Emily one evening 2 weeks earlier. "Emily," his voice was low and serious over the phone, "are you certain you want to do this? Confront your father directly, at his own birthday party, in front of 200 guests." "I've waited 11 years for this moment, Governor," Emily replied, her calm strange even to her own ears. "I don't need to hide anything anymore. If he thinks I'll stay silent forever just because I carry the Miller name, he's mistaken." "All right," Governor Sullivan sighed, "but you have to promise me one thing, let the law do its job. Don't let personal emotion take over. Our agents will be there, posing as guests. When the moment is right, we'll move." Emily nodded, even though he couldn't see her through the phone. "I understand." That night, after hanging up, she sat alone in her small Manhattan apartment, looking out at the window where city lights glittered like artificial stars. Her daughter, Lily, now 11, was fast asleep in the next room. Emily walked in, sat on the edge of the bed, and watched her daughter's peaceful face. "You will never have to live in fear the way I once did," she thought silently. "I'll make sure of that." In the days before the gala, Emily worked without rest. She and the investigation team combed through every last detail of the file, making sure no gap could let the case collapse in court. She also made time to visit the aunt who had taken her in 11 years earlier, the only person from the extended Miller family who had stayed in contact with Emily through those difficult years. Aunt Margaret, now well into her 70s, lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of Boston, and greeted Emily with a pot of hot tea and worried eyes. "Are you sure you want to do this, Emily?" Aunt Margaret asked, her hand trembling slightly as she poured the tea. "Robert is my brother. I know what kind of man he is, cold, ambitious, but I never thought he would go so far as to drive you away, and now to use your name to cover up his crimes." "I'm not doing this out of hatred, Aunt Margaret," Emily said, taking hold of her aunt's wrinkled hand. "I'm doing this for justice. For Lily. I want her to grow up in a world where the truth always matters, no matter who has to pay the price for it." Aunt Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. "I'm proud of you, you know that. I've always been proud." The night before the gala, Emily couldn't sleep. She stood before the mirror in her Chicago hotel room, where she'd checked in to prepare for the next day. The long black dress she would wear hung neatly on its hanger, not an ostentatious gown, but simple, elegant, commanding, like the armor of a warrior about to enter her final battle. She opened the black leather briefcase, checking one last time the most critical documents, the forged signature comparison report, bank statements from the Kaiman accounts, and most important of all, a secret audio recording that a former accountant at the Miller Renewal Fund, racked by years of guilty conscience, had handed over to the FBI. A recording in which Ashley Miller, in a private conversation 3 years earlier, had let slip that Emily's signature is easy to fake. "I practiced it since high school." Emily closed the briefcase and took a deep breath. Tomorrow, everything would change. The peninsula Chicago blazed with light that Saturday evening. The grand ballroom was lavishly decorated with white orchids, crystal chandeliers, and a small orchestra playing soft classical pieces. 200 guests, the most powerful figures of Chicago's elite, from businessmen and politicians to familiar faces from the financial pages, had gathered to celebrate Robert Miller's 65th birthday. Robert stood at the center of the room in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo, a satisfied smile on his lips as he received congratulations from his guests. He had waited a long time for this moment, not just his birthday, but the official announcement that he would transfer part of his executive authority over the corporation to his youngest daughter, Ashley, whom he had always considered the sole worthy heir left to the Miller family. Sarah Miller, in an elegant navy evening gown studded with jewels, stood beside her husband, wearing the perfect smile of a society wife long accustomed to performing happiness in public for decades. But her eyes, as they swept over the crowd, occasionally flickered with something else, perhaps unease, though she tried to bury it beneath flawless makeup. Ashley Miller, 29, radiant in a vivid red gown, wore their grandmother's diamond necklace at her throat, a family heirloom that should rightfully have gone to the eldest daughter. She moved through the crowd with the confidence of someone about to be officially named heir to the Miller Meridian Empire. None of them knew that, at that very moment, a black limousine was pulling into the hotel's parking area, and inside it, Emily Miller sat, with her back straight, one hand resting on the black leather briefcase in her lap, her eyes fixed straight ahead. 9 o'clock. The grand doors of the ballroom swung open. Emily walked in with the bearing of a queen returning to her kingdom. Her long black dress clung elegantly to her figure, her honey-brown hair was swept into a neat updo, revealing a sharp face and cold blue eyes she had inherited from the very father standing not far away. Her hand gripped the black leather folder tightly. The music continued, but the conversations around the room slowly quieted as people registered this unexpected arrival. Whispers spread quickly through the hall. Is that Emily Miller, Robert's eldest daughter? I heard she's been missing for over a decade. She has the nerve to show up here. Sarah Miller was the first to react. She strode quickly through the crowd, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor, her expression shifting from shock to fury within seconds. You? Sarah hissed, standing face to face with her daughter. You dare show your face here to humiliate us after 11 years? And then, in full view of all 200 guests, Sarah Miller raised her hand and struck her daughter across the face. The slap rang out sharply, cutting through the music, plunging the entire ballroom into absolute silence. Emily's cheek burned, but she didn't step back, didn't raise a hand to touch the red mark forming on her skin. She simply stood there, spine straight, and slowly let a cold, unnervingly calm smile spread across her lips. I came to reclaim what belongs to me, Sarah, Emily said, her voice carrying clearly through the silence, loud enough for those nearby to hear, and the way she addressed her mother by first name, without a trace of respect, left many guests even more stunned. Robert Miller, standing a few steps away, his face flushed with anger, moved closer, leaning down toward his daughter's ear, his voice dropping into a cold threat. Get out through the kitchen door before security breaks your neck, he hissed through clenched teeth. Don't sully this family's reputation any further. Emily looked up at her father, her eyes unflinching. This family's reputation, she said, loud enough for those around them to hear, has been filthy for a long time, father. I'm only here to drag it into the light. Hearing the commotion, Ashley Miller pushed through the crowd, their grandmother's diamond necklace glittering under the chandelier light. She looked her sister up and down with a mixture of contempt and something harder to name, perhaps anxiety she was trying to conceal. Still an addict, Emily? Ashley said, loud enough for those around to hear, a mocking smile on her lips. Or did you come back to beg for money to raise that bastard child of yours? The remark, spoken so openly, made several nearby guests wince with discomfort. But Emily didn't flinch. She stood tall, her eyes never leaving her sister's, and when she spoke, her voice was calm to a frightening degree, the calm of someone who had prepared for this moment for 11 long years. Bastard child, Emily repeated, almost laughing. My daughter's name is Lily, Ashley. And she's not the only shameful thing in this family. She turned to look around the room, at the faces watching her father, her mother, her sister, and hundreds of curious eyes belonging to Chicago's elite. 11 years ago, Emily said, her voice ringing through the ballroom now sunk in heavy silence, when I was 19 and pregnant, this family gave me two choices: terminate the child in my womb, or leave home forever. I chose my daughter. She opened the folder slightly, drawing out a page yellowed with age. But what none of you know, she continued, is that the very night I was thrown out of this house, the Miller family didn't just strike my name from the family trust. They also secretly purchased a $10 million life insurance policy in my name, on the condition that I disappear from the United States permanently. Murmurs rippled quickly through the ballroom. Several guests turned to look at Robert Miller, who stood rigid, his face drained of color. You're lying, Robert snapped, but this time his voice no longer carried its usual authority, it trembled, unmistakably. I have the documents right here, father, Emily replied, raising the folder. Your signature, and the signature of our family's private attorney, are both right here. Would you like me to read it aloud to the 200 guests in this room? Robert said nothing. He stood there, fists clenched, trying to hold his composure in front of the crowd, but his eyes betrayed a panic that a man of his power rarely allowed himself to show. Just as the tension in the room grew unbearable, two security guards in black suits, acting on Robert's orders, began moving toward Emily, preparing to remove her from the ballroom by force if necessary. But before they could reach her, a deep, commanding voice rang out from the head table. "Robert, wait." The entire room turned toward the sound. Governor James Sullivan, a silver-haired man with an imposing presence, rose from his seat of honor, where he had sat quietly observing since the start of the evening. As a former federal prosecutor before entering politics, and now one of the most influential figures in Illinois's justice system, his presence at the head table had already raised eyebrows at the start of the party. Now, as he stood and spoke, that surprise turned into breathless anticipation. The two guards froze, uncertain whether to proceed. Governor Sullivan walked slowly through the crowd, every eye following his steps, until he came to stand beside Emily. He looked directly into the eyes of Robert Miller, his old friend of many decades, with a gravity no one in the room had ever seen from him before. "She isn't here as your daughter, Robert," Governor Sullivan said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "She's here as legal counsel for a federal investigation." Robert Miller's expression instantly transformed, from fury to a raw fear he had never once shown in public across his entire 40-year career. He stared at the black folder in Emily's hands, and in that moment, it seemed he understood. Tonight would no longer be his birthday celebration, but the end of the empire he had spent his whole life building. "James," Robert stammered, struggling to regain his composure, "this is surely some kind of misunderstanding. This girl left the family years ago. She has nothing to do with the corporation's business anymore." "Nothing to do with it," Emily cut in, her voice sharp and cold. "Then why does my signature appear on $14 million in illegal transfers from the Miller Renewal Charitable Fund to anonymous accounts in the Cayman Islands over the past 3 years?" A wave of shocked murmurs swept through the ballroom like a rising tide. Several guests began reaching for their phones, though none dared openly film, yet everyone sensed they were witnessing a historic moment, the collapse of one of Chicago's most powerful dynasties, unfolding right before their eyes. Sarah Miller, standing beside her husband, had gone pale as paper. "Emily, what are you talking about? This is your father's birthday party, please don't turn it into..." "Into what, mother?" Emily turned to face her mother, her eyes utterly without softness now. "A place where the truth comes out. I think it's about time." She gave a light snap of her fingers, a signal arranged beforehand with the technical crew she had quietly contacted days earlier, the team operating the massive LED screen at the back of the ballroom, originally set to play a tribute video for the Miller family as part of the evening's planned program. The enormous screen, nearly 6 meters tall, flickered and changed. Instead of the warm family photos everyone expected, the screen filled with financial spreadsheets, rows of bank transfer figures, and account statements stamped in red, "Confidential, Federal Investigation Evidence." Gasps of horror rippled through the ballroom. Ashley Miller, standing not far from her sister, instinctively stepped back, a trembling hand rising to cover her mouth. "This," Emily said, her voice ringing out like a bell in the suffocating silence, "is evidence that the Miller Renewal Charitable Fund, established, supposedly, to support underprivileged children in Chicago, was used to launder $14 million through forged transactions, all signed under my name." She pointed up at the screen, where an enlarged image of the forged signature appeared beside her authentic signature, verified by independent handwriting experts. "But I never signed a single one of these documents," Emily continued, "because for the past 11 years, I never once set foot inside that foundation's offices." She turned to look directly at Ashley, her eyes like a cold blade. "What's most repulsive," Emily said, her voice dropping, but still clear enough for everyone to hear, "is that my signature was forged by my own sister, Ashley, practiced since she was a teenager, so that if this were ever discovered, all the blame would fall on me, the daughter thrown out of the family, with no one left to defend her." "No," Ashley stammered, taking another step back, her face bloodless. "That's not true, you're making this up." "Making it up," Emily cut in coldly. She snapped her fingers again. From the ballroom sound system, an audio recording began to play, Ashley's own voice, from 3 years earlier, in a private conversation she had no idea had been recorded. "Emily's signature is easy to fake, I've practiced it since high school. She's not even here to worry about it, who's going to check?" The brief recording, playing clearly through the deathly silence of the room, landed like a final blade cutting through any possible denial. Ashley stood frozen, with no words left to defend herself. Tears began streaking down her perfectly made-up face, smearing her mascara, but no one in the ballroom felt any sympathy for her anymore. Sarah Miller, standing beside her husband, had gone pale as paper. "Emily, what are you talking about? This is your father's birthday party, please don't turn it into..." "Into what, mother?" Emily turned to face her mother, her eyes utterly without softness now. "A place where the truth comes out. I think it's about time." At that moment, from the ballroom's various entrances, several guests, who had gone unnoticed all evening, began moving with sudden purpose. They converged toward the center of the room, drawing small bronze gold badges from their jackets, Department of Justice credentials. "Ladies and gentlemen," a stern-faced middle-aged man announced, standing near the main stage area, "I'm Special Agent Daniel Foster with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have a warrant for the arrest of Mr. Robert Miller and Ms. Ashley Miller, in connection with charges of financial fraud, money laundering, and forgery." Panicked murmurs swept through the ballroom. Some guests hurried toward the exits, wanting no part of the unfolding scandal. Others stood frozen, unable to look away from a scene unlike anything they'd ever witnessed. Robert Miller, seeing the agents approach, tried to summon what little authority he had left. "You have no right." "We have full authority, Mr. Miller," Agent Foster replied, his voice calm but firm, presenting the signed warrant. "Please cooperate." Sarah Miller stood frozen beside her husband, both hands pressed to her face, unable to believe what was happening before her eyes. The empire she had spent her life building, the reputation she had valued above even motherhood, was now collapsing in front of 200 witnesses. She gave a light snap of her fingers, a signal arranged beforehand with the technical crew she had quietly contacted days earlier, the team operating the massive LED screen at the back of the ballroom, originally set to play a tribute video for the Miller family as part of the evening's planned program. The enormous screen, nearly 6 meters tall, flickered and changed. Instead of the warm family photos everyone expected, the screen filled with financial spreadsheets, rows of bank transfer figures, and account statements stamped in red, "Confidential, Federal Investigation Evidence." Gasps of horror rippled through the ballroom. Ashley Miller, standing not far from her sister, instinctively stepped back, a trembling hand rising to cover her mouth. "This," Emily said, her voice ringing out like a bell in the suffocating silence, "is evidence that the Miller Renewal Charitable Fund, established, supposedly, to support underprivileged children in Chicago, was used to launder $14 million through forged transactions, all signed under my name." She pointed up at the screen, where an enlarged image of the forged signature appeared beside her authentic signature, verified by independent handwriting experts. "But I never signed a single one of these documents," Emily continued, "because for the past 11 years, I never once set foot inside that foundation's offices." She turned to look directly at Ashley, her eyes like a cold blade. "What's most repulsive," Emily said, her voice dropping, but still clear enough for everyone to hear, "is that my signature was forged by my own sister, Ashley, practiced since she was a teenager, so that if this were ever discovered, all the blame would fall on me, the daughter thrown out of the family, with no one left to defend her." "No," Ashley stammered, taking another step back, her face bloodless. "That's not true, you're making this up." "Making it up," Emily cut in coldly. She snapped her fingers again. From the ballroom sound system, an audio recording began to play, Ashley's own voice, from 3 years earlier, in a private conversation she had no idea had been recorded. "Emily's signature is easy to fake, I've practiced it since high school. She's not even here to worry about it, who's going to check?" The brief recording, playing clearly through the deathly silence of the room, landed like a final blade cutting through any possible denial. Ashley stood frozen, with no words left to defend herself. Tears began streaking down her perfectly made-up face, smearing her mascara, but no one in the ballroom felt any sympathy for her anymore. Before the agents led Robert out of the ballroom, he turned to look at Emily one last time, his eyes no longer carrying their usual cold authority, but something closer to desperate pleading. "Emily," he said, his voice shaking, "we're family, we can work this out. Whatever you want, I'll give it to you, just take it back." "You lost the right to call me family," Emily cut in, her voice cold and resolute, "the night you threw me a one-way plane ticket, and a paper demanding I never see my own child." She looked her father straight in the eye, without a trace of hesitation. "I didn't come here for money, father. I came here for the truth, and the truth," finally, has come out. Robert Miller had no more words left. His shoulders, once held so straight, so commanding through 40 years of running a business empire, now sagged in despair as federal agents cuffed his wrists and led him out of the ballroom before the eyes of all of Chicago's elite. Ashley, tears streaming down her face, was led out behind him, trying to catch her mother's eye, but Sarah Miller only stood there, motionless, like a stone statue amid a storm sweeping away everything she had ever built. Emily stood alone in the emptying ballroom, as most of the guests fled in a panic, leaving only a few cleanup staff and agents finishing the last of their procedures. Governor Sullivan came to stand beside her, resting a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did well, Emily," he said softly. "Not everyone has the courage to face their own family like that." Emily nodded, a faint smile, half relief, half pain, flickering across her lips. "Thank you, Governor. Thank you for trusting me." She looked around the ballroom one last time, a room that had once symbolized the wealth and power of the Miller dynasty, now littered with empty chairs, half-finished glasses of wine, and the ruins of a fallen empire. Walking out of the hall, Emily paused briefly in the hotel's grand lobby. She looked down at the small honor medallion the Miller family had once awarded to its most accomplished members, a medallion that, even after 11 years away from the family, she had always carried in her wallet as a reminder of where she once belonged. She took it out, looked at it one last time, and then calmly dropped it into a trash bin right there in the hotel lobby. It wasn't a dramatic gesture meant to prove anything to anyone. It was simply a release. She no longer needed that medallion, no longer needed the Miller name, to define who she was. Outside, rain poured down over Chicago, cold droplets lashing her face, as she stepped out from beneath the hotel awning. But Emily didn't falter. She tilted her face up toward the sky, letting the rain wash away the weight that had pressed down on her shoulders for 11 years. She pulled out her phone and dialed her daughter, who was at home in New York with the babysitter. "Hello, Mom?" Lily's voice came through, bright and innocent. "Lily, it's me," Emily said, her voice thick but warm. "Starting tomorrow, we are changing our last name. We are not Millers anymore." There was a brief pause on the other end, then Lily's voice came back, curious but unafraid. "So what's our new name going to be?" Emily smiled in the rain. For the first time in 11 years, she felt a true breath of freedom fill her chest. "I don't know yet, sweetheart," she answered gently. "But we'll choose it together. A brand new name, carrying none of the past's weight." Behind her, the wail of police sirens rose, red and blue lights reflecting off the rain-slicked puddles on the pavement. Reporters, no one quite sure when they'd gathered, kept their cameras flashing as Robert Miller and Ashley Miller, hands cuffed, were led out of the hotel and into the waiting police cars. The flashes kept firing, illuminating the despairing face of a man who had once been among the most powerful businessmen in Chicago, now nothing more than a defendant in a massive financial fraud case. Emily stood there in the rain, watching the scene unfold without any sense of triumph or gloating. Only a deep, quiet relief, as if a massive stone that had pressed on her chest for 11 years had finally been lifted away. She didn't turn back for one last look at her parents. She no longer needed to. The past, with all its wounds and lies, had officially closed behind her. Emily walked on through the Chicago rain, each step steady, heading toward the car waiting to take her back to New York, back to her daughter, back to the life she had built with her own two hands, dependent on no one, carrying the name of no powerful dynasty at all. The trial of Robert Miller and Ashley Miller stretched on for nearly 6 months, drawing national media attention. With the irrefutable evidence Emily and the federal investigation team had gathered, both were convicted with severe sentences. Robert Miller received 9 years in prison for large-scale financial fraud and obstruction of justice. Ashley Miller received 6 years for forgery and complicity in money laundering. Miller Meridian Corporation, placed under court oversight, was forced to restructure its entire leadership. Sarah Miller, though not criminally charged due to insufficient evidence of her direct involvement in the illegal transactions, lost her standing among Chicago's elite, the very thing she had valued above all else. The estate in Lake Forest, once host to countless lavish parties, now stood silent, holding only a lonely woman among walls that had once symbolized a fallen empire. Emily, after completing her role in the investigation, returned to New York and continued her legal career. She and Lily now carried a new surname, one the two of them had chosen together on a rainy evening after returning from Chicago, symbolizing an entirely fresh start, free from the burdens of the past. On an autumn afternoon, as golden leaves drifted lightly through the streets of New York, Emily stood at her office window, looking down at the bustling crowds below. Her phone buzzed, a message from Aunt Margaret. "I'm proud of you, Emily. You proved that the truth, no matter how long it's buried, always finds its way into the light." Emily smiled, typing back a short reply, "Thank you, Aunt Margaret. I learned that from my own life." She slipped the phone back into her pocket and returned to her desk, where a new stack of files awaited, other cases, other families, other truths waiting to be uncovered. But this time, Emily stepped into each case not carrying the weight of a painful past, but with the strength of someone who had learned to stand firmly on her own 2 feet. That evening, when Emily came home, Lily sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, warm yellow light falling across her innocent face. Emily set down her bag, walked over, and kissed the top of her daughter's head. "Mom," Lily looked up, "my teacher asked about my grandparents. What should I tell her?" Emily sat down beside her daughter, thinking for a moment before answering, her voice gentle but sure. "You can tell her that our family is made up of the people we choose to love, Lily, not the people blood ties us to. You have me, you have Aunt Margaret, you have good friends around you. That's our real family." Lily nodded, seeming to grasp some part of the deeper meaning in her mother's words, then turned back to her homework. Emily stood and walked to the window, looking out at the New York night sky, glittering with lights. She thought about the 11 years that had passed, from a young girl cast out by her own family, to a woman who had rebuilt her life from nothing with her own 2 hands, and who had finally stood up to demand justice, not only for herself, but for the countless nameless victims exploited by the greed and deceit of the powerful. "The true legacy I leave my daughter," Emily thought quietly, her eyes softening as she watched Lily bent over her homework, "isn't money, or reputation, or a famous family name. It's the courage to face the truth, no matter how painful, and the strength to build a new life with your own 2 hands." Outside, the city of New York carried on, alive with millions of other stories unfolding, millions of intertwined fates. But inside this small, warm apartment, a new chapter in Emily and Lily's lives had officially begun, a chapter with no trace of the old lies, no heavy legacy from the past, only truth, love, and a future that belonged entirely to them.